Hey Anna,
Hey, Mike.
so we've just finished Billy's first 60 days of Antinol, and wow, what a difference.
Really? Oh my gosh, what have you noticed?
Well, he's shiner, he's much more energetic. Not that he wasn't beforehand, but you can see the difference. But remember, I told you he used to have that little limp in his back left paw that he'd hurt himself when he was a pup. But he
Yes,
doesn't seem
yes.
to do that much anymore.
What, the hop, skip, and the jump?
Yeah, yeah. So it's like his joints are a bit better. And we actually had friends around this weekend who'd noticed that there was something good about Billy. And I was telling them about Antinol, and they said, "Oh, what's in it?" I said, "Well, green lip mussel." And they said, "What's that?" And I go, "Oh, well, I don't know. I'll have to ask Anna," as I always do. So
Well,
for next
green,
time, what should I say? What's so great
well,
about green lip mussel?
green lip mussel, it comes from New Zealand. It's the only place that green lip mussels live. And what's great about the green lip mussel is that it is what's known as a broad spectrum source of omega 3. And the reason dogs need to take omega 3 is that their bodies don't make it themselves. So, unless they're getting it through, their diet, which can be omega 6 heavy. And it's very important to have a balance between omega 6 and omega 3. So it's normally through supplements that omega 3 is given. And green lip mussel is unique in its having everything from EPA, DHA, and ETA. So all the main omega 3s.
And how about Binks and Prudence? They must be much better as well.
Yeah, well, they've been on it for over a year and they've been on green lip mussel forever since I've had them. So Prue's 10 now. So she's had green lip mussel since the first day I brought her home, to be honest, but not Antinol. And I only wish I'd discovered Antinol earlier. I really honestly mean that because it's an oil rather than a powder. So its bioavailability, that means, its effectivity to get absorbed quickly and efficiently by the body is greater.
So people listening now and they want to discover Antinol for themselves, where do they go?
Well, all you have to do is go to Antinol, antinol.co.uk, and then type in Anna Webb and get your special discount. Hello, I'm Anna Webb, and welcome to my podcast, A Dog's Life. In today's episode, I'm talking to the scientist Carly Ameen all about the emergence and diversification of dog morphology. And as ever, this is powered by Antinol. Carly Ameen, welcome to A Dog's Life.
Thanks so much.
Now, you're a bioarchaeologist, is that right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Please, can you explain what that is? Is it related to paleontology?
Not quite. So the main difference between archaeology and paleontology is that archaeology has humans involved. So as an archaeologist and specifically as a bioarchaeologist, I study bone remains from archaeological sites of both humans and animals to try to better understand the past from that line of archaeological evidence.
That's so fascinating. I bet this has taken you all around the globe.
Yeah, I was really lucky, especially during my PhD, to travel to lots of different archives and museums that hold really lovely, amazing collections of bone material from archaeological sites to study.
Amazing. And of course, the study we're talking about today, which I'm really fascinated about actually, is how would you describe it? The morphology of the dog?
Yeah, so the project was really trying to understand where dogs came from. They're really important to humans today, of course, but also well into the past. We've had dogs living with us for a long time. And the paper that's just recently come out was a product of a really long running study into the origins of the domestic dog, where we're trying to understand where, when, and how humans first made those really early relationships with wolves that eventually turned into dogs.
Yeah, because it's been a question that really has remained unanswered, and hasn't it? And the time frame, some people say it was only like 10,000 years ago. Other people will say, it's 30,000. And I think in your research, you're actually postulating that it could be 50,000 years.
Well, so it's true that the timing is still really unclear. We are getting better at narrowing that window down into the time period that we know that dog domestication must have had to happen based on the archaeological evidence, the bones that we find in the ground, and based on genetic data and other types of sort of scientific analysis to try to model where we predict this divergence between wolves and dogs happened. So from the work that we've just recently published, it definitely happens before 11,000 years ago. And that's pretty consistent across all these different lines of evidence. And we know that because by the time we start to see these changes in the shape of wolves to dogs, that those relationships had to have already been forming. But how far back into the past is still unclear. The paper looked at canids and wolves and dogs from 50,000 years ago to try to capture where this window might be. So we're not suggesting that dogs were domesticated 50,000 years ago, but we were trying to get a really good picture of what's happening in what we refer to as the late Pleistocene, the end of the last ice age, to fully capture, to make sure we didn't miss anything.
It's so interesting because the thing is this, it remains a massive mystery. But if I've got this right, this research is based on skulls particularly, and you've accumulated almost 700, I think, different skulls from different parts of the world of dogs. And what you've seen is that the change in the shape of the skulls happened much further ago than we've really thought. We probably thought that dogs remained looking pretty wolf-like. I mean, there are still wolf dogs, around in our modern day, and obviously some dogs like a German Shepherd maybe are a bit more wolfy, typically wolf-like than, say, a Pekingese or a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel that don't look anything like a wolf at all. Yet the extraordinary thing is all dogs are 99.9% DNA wolf, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, so there is still a really close genetic link between dogs and wolves. And you're right. We were looking at skull shape, and this is for a couple of reasons. Because dogs are really important to humans well back into prehistory, and they're not a food animal. So when we think about animal domestication, we often think about the livestock kind of farm animals that live around us that we eat. And of course, the majority of the animals that we've domesticated are because of these kind of incentives to have more food more easily available to us. But dogs are not that. So dogs predate any of these other domestic animals. So that relationship happens well before we have farming and livestock. But it also, because they're not food, it means that they are buried in the archaeological record in different ways than you would imagine just the waste from your dinner would be deposited. So we get a really good preservation of dog skulls and wolf skulls. Well, we usually say canid when we're not sure. So we don't, but those kinds of skulls in the archaeological record because of this really close relationship that humans have with the canids around them. And that means that we had a really good number of skulls to look at for the study, as you said, over 600 skulls that we looked at. And that's something that we don't see in the archaeological record with many other species. So it's something that's really unique to dogs and really allowed us to explore the diversity of dogs into the past, and how that relates to the diversity that we see today.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yesterday, actually, I was in the House of Lords. I was honoured to be invited to, learn firsthand. I'm sure you've heard about this happening in the press already about innate health assessment. And it's all it's all about, countering a lot of round-shaped heads, short noses, the fact that some dogs have backs that are way too long, their legs have got shorter and shorter, and a lot of dogs find it hard to breathe now because their noses are so short. And it's all blamed, all of this is kind of blamed on the Victorian period. It was the Victorians, they were dog fanciers, they selected for certain shapes and sizes for different purposes. I mean, we've got to remember in the Victorian era, dogs had a purpose. They weren't just sitting on your sofa all day watching telly. They were out killing rats because we had no sewers, and the list goes on, helping us bring the livestock to market and all the rest of it. But where I'm going with this is, it's now become evident that we've taken it all too far, and the Victorians are blamed for this health crisis that we've got many pedigree dogs into. But, through your research, arguably this shaping of dogs, selecting for certain sizes, heads, mouth lengths. It was going on a very long time ago.
Yeah, so that was one of the things that was really surprising about the work that we did. What we were hoping to find was a separation between the wolves and the dogs. So a way to identify when we first start to see dogs in the archaeological record. So we did that. So that was nice. But the additional thing that we found that was a bit more surprising was just the sheer amount of diversity in dog skull shapes once they appear in the archaeological record. So the time period that we're talking about is 10 to 11,000 years ago. So the transition between when humans are hunter-gatherers into these early agricultural communities. And by the time that we start to identify dogs and the skull shape that's distinct from the wolf, it's not just one kind of skull. We see loads of variation. And in fact, almost half of the variation that's exhibited by modern dogs today across all of the breeds that we know and love is already present in about 10,000 years ago. And that was something that we were really surprised to see because, of course, you're absolutely right. The narrative is that the Victorians have honed in on these specialist traits and morphologies and shapes and sizes. And that's really where that all kind of began. And that's still true to some extent. So what we don't see in the archaeological record is some of these really extreme shapes that you were just describing. We don't see the really shortened snouts of things like the French bulldog or the pug. We don't see the really elongated or flexed skulls of things like the bull terrier. So those really extreme morphologies, maybe the ones that we're most concerned about when we think about the health of our dogs today, are not ones that we see in the archaeological record. But we still see such a wide amount of diversity that it suggests that humans for a really long time, and the relationship between humans and dogs that's persisted for such a long time, had a really dramatic effect on the way dogs looked, and that it wasn't just the Victorians, though they might have enhanced some of the most extreme things that we see today.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I spent an afternoon in the Kennel Club library, actually, down at Green Park a few years ago, and I was looking at this ancient book that was written in Latin. So obviously, I couldn't read any of it, but you could see that the book was describing four main types of dogs. So you had the greyhoundy type looking dogs. You had terriers, the tears, the terrors, the dogs that would go to the ground. So I'm not sure because I haven't really studied history. I don't know when Latin was kind of still the main language for everyone to read and write with. But certainly it was interesting to see there weren't millions of different types of breeds, but there were types of dogs that had already obviously been shaped for a purpose, because we would have changed dogs to suit ourselves for the maximum effect, really. Would you agree on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So the Romans are quite famous for this, and some of the Latin work will, of course, be attributed to early Roman kind of writing. And yeah, we certainly know that the Romans were really interested in different types of all sorts of species, dogs included. So some of the work that you see that they're writing about, they're of course describing these terriers and these greyhounds, but they also are really they are one of the first kind of lines of evidence for these companion dogs that we see. So maybe the closest to the relationship that we have with dogs today. Descriptions of what a lap dog should look like. Lots of lovely evidence of gravestones for dogs, or gravestones for humans that have their dogs kind of depicted as part of either the inscription or the carvings on that. And then lots of interesting evidence for guard dogs and much larger kind of military related dogs that have very specific kind of rules about what color their coat should be, what you should feed them, all sorts of things. So the Romans were really interested in thinking about these different types. It's hard to say whether or not that's a breed as we know it today, but there was certainly a diversity of dogs in the Roman world that people were manipulating the size and shapes of to get the kind of the activities they wanted, and to get the shape and the size and the physical appearance that they were interested in as well.
That's so interesting. I didn't really know. I mean, obviously we all know Shakespeare and Julius Caesar, where there's a famous quote where it goes something like, "Release the dogs of war," and and that was obviously the Roman period, Julius Caesar. So, and they had big mastiffs that apparently went to war with them, and but again, yes, these lap dogs. So I suppose for the kind of more affluent ladies in society at that time. Their funny little companions, their best friends would be things like the Italian greyhounds, which I suppose were the runts of the litter from their hunting hounds. And they maybe just thought, oh gosh, this is so cute. Let's put the runts of the litter from the greyhounds together and we'll get baby small greyhounds. Because that's a very old breed, the Italian greyhound. And we know that from Renaissance art because they're everywhere in Renaissance art. I know that's still quite modern compared to the time frame you're working with there, but hopefully, yeah. I mean, do you think this is how it happened?
I mean, I think that iconographic evidence, so evidence from paintings, from carvings, from drawings, and all that kind of work is really important when we start to think about not just the relationship with dogs, but the diversification of them. And so it's really lovely to have the kind of evidence that you've just described, the paintings, the inscriptions, and all these kinds of things to say, this is what people, because of course, this is something we can't get from the bones alone, and especially not from the skull, right? So we can get a general idea of the skull shape and size, but we don't know anything about how big the animal was overall, what its coat was like, what its coloring was like. So it's really nice to be able to draw on these kind of just drawings and other types of artwork to really hone in on that exact kind of what they would have looked like when they were alive, which is of course when humans were working with them. There's some really nice archaeological work from a site in the north of England called Vindolanda, which is a Roman fort site. And they have loads of dog remains recovered from there. And the diversity of those dogs is enormous. You see these really huge, kind of possibly size of a Mastiff dogs, but you also see some not just small dogs, but ones with the shorter leg kind of comparison. So similar to like a corgi type of thing. We don't think that these are descendants of any of these modern breeds, but you start to see a huge amount of variation, not just in the size and the shape, but also the proportion of the dog. So how the limbs relate to the overall body size. And it's really fascinating kind of snapshot of Roman life on what is really the frontier of the Roman Empire at this time. About the north of England's about as far away as you can get from Rome and still be in the Roman Empire. And it's really interesting to see the huge diversity of dogs that were even in this kind of really remote part of the Roman Empire.
So fascinating. I didn't know that place existed. I really want to go and visit. Crumbs. That's amazing, Carly. So are you saying that from the skulls, you've obviously created 3D models, haven't you, of all the skulls that you've got?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you not sort of attach, because I've got a tiny dog here. He's an English toy terrier, very old breed, actually, and very old-fashioned, if you like. Like he totally passes the innate health assessment with flying colors. He's got everything, the long nose, the long legs, he's slightly built, he can run like the Bionic Man. He's got ears that are like radars, he's got a tail that can sort of guide him at speed. The English toy terrier killed millions of rats, saved us from the bubonic plague. Quite a hero of a breed, actually, but sadly he's a breed that's facing extinction. Nobody knows the English toy terrier exists, and they are extremely vulnerable at the moment, which is such a shame. It's just no one knows there is an English toy terrier. A lot's being done to kind of change that, but I find him, he's got a tiny head. That's my point. So surely a tiny head would have a tinier body than, say, Prudence here, who's my miniature bull terrier, has got a bigger head. I don't know, would there not be a way of kind of working out the body size according to the head?
You could make an approximation, of course, because you're right, like overall, like smaller heads have to be on smaller bodies just to physically to hold them up and all those kinds of things. But there's actually like quite a lot of nuance in the height of dogs, where so if you think about something like a Great Dane, it's very big, but the head is proportional to it, where if you think of a breed like maybe a Saint Bernard, it would be arguably shorter than the Great Dane usually, but the skull is just absolutely massive, right? Like, so you have this widening and just really robusticity that you find in Saint Bernard skulls, especially the most recent modern ones, where they're really selecting for this really huge skull shape that isn't proportional to like the comparison between the height of the Great Dane and its skull.
Yeah, sure.
So
sure.
it can be a bit risky. So you can get, generally, yes, the bigger skulls probably belong to bigger dogs, and that's totally fine. But starting to understand that proportionality, which is really what drives the breed characteristics that we're looking at today, right? It's not just the size, it's the whole conformation of the animal. How like you were talking about at the beginning, how the legs and the tail, how they hold that tail, how the legs fit with the rest of the body, and that all that proportionality. That's the stuff that modern breeders are looking at when they're looking at breed characteristics, and that's just not something we can get from just a skull alone.
No, I get that. No, I get that. But nevertheless, it's interesting, isn't it? When we know from history, and we're saying about art, the whole area of like Asia is said to be, I think, where a lot of dogs emerge from. And if you think back to sort of, the Chinese emperors and the Ming dynasty, I don't know when the Ming dynasty fits with your research. I mean, it's obviously a long time ago, but we know that there was a Pekingese from original silk paintings, or a dog that is a Pekingese, which obviously is a curious shape. I mean, back then, they actually looked like a Tibetan Spaniel. They didn't have a squash face. They actually had legs, but they were small, and they were designed to live up emperor's sleeves, so they had to be, and they were like hot water bottles before central heating, Yeah, so, I mean, and that's very different looking from a wolf.
Yes. Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that when we talk about our research, especially with people who are dog owners or dog lovers, it's really nice to reflect on the fact that all of these animals are wolves, right? Like, they're wolves that have lived with us for such a long time that their shape and size and coat coloring has exploded into just absolutely huge amounts of variation. One of the most diverse mammals that we have on the planet is the domestic dog today. But at one point, that potential in terms of the genes and the genetics is in the wolf, right? It could only have come from that potential diversity that wolves already had in their own populations. And I think it's really interesting to reflect on that when you might be sitting next to a Pekingese on your sofa and going, you're a wolf. You'd probably be a really bad wolf, but somewhere in there's that relationship that still exists. And I think it's a really fascinating part about this particular relationship that we have with this domestic species that does all of these jobs for us and lives in our homes and comforts us and is our companion in all these different ways. And yeah, really retains just a little bit of that wolf in them. And maybe some breeds exhibit that more than others, and not necessarily just the ones that look like wolves.
No, oh gosh, absolutely. The smaller the dog, the bigger the personality, I generally find, to be honest. Surely as well, all of the kind of, I was going to say climate change, but it's the wrong word, all of the ice ages and so on, and the shifts and the kind of earthquakes and volcanoes erupting over thousands and thousands of years kind of shifted stuff so that wood dogs have kind of migrated, from their original inception as the world changed.
So this is one of the outstanding questions that we have as archaeologists who are studying dog domestication is it's not just that we are not exactly sure when exactly the timing of this relationship happened, but we still don't know where. And this is really important because the gray wolf, which is the ancestor of all domestic dogs, lives across the entirety of the Northern Hemisphere. So its native range is all of Europe, all of Northern Asia, all of North America, right? It lives from Saudi Arabia up into Russia, in the US in the Americas, from Mexico all the way into the Canadian Arctic. So it has an absolutely massive native range. And it's much more restricted now, right, as in the modern world, because of urbanization and all sorts of changes to the way humans engage with the wild and the natural world. But in the period we're talking about, in 10 to 20,000 years ago, wolves were everywhere. And this makes it really hard for us to find the specific population of wolves that actually contributed to domestic dogs. What we do know is that none of the modern wolf populations that geneticists have analyzed today are the direct ancestors of domestic dogs. So we know that the species is the gray wolf, but we don't know exactly which population. And then that means that we don't know exactly where in the world this relationship happened, or whether or not it happened multiple times. And that's something we see with other domestic animals as well. So pigs are a good example of this. We have two kind of domestication events happening in the Near East, like in Mesopotamia, and then also in China. And then eventually they kind of come together to merge to make modern pig populations. So we don't know for sure, but it's absolutely certain that not just human intervention, but the overall kind of environmental changes that happened at the end of the Ice Age as we enter what we call the Holocene, so the recent kind of environmental period that we're living in today, where the planet got warmer, the glaciers receded, and it kind of created the world that as we live in it today, would have had an effect on both the dogs and the wolves. And so we see this kind of change because of changes in climate and changes in environments and changes to habitat as people start to kind of build their cities and make a bigger imprint on the natural world.
Yeah, no, amazing. It's interesting. I'm watching an Attenborough program at the moment that's on. I don't know if you've watched it. It's on Sunday. It's called, Who's Going to Rule the Kingdom, actually, or something. And wild dogs, the painted African dogs. They're not painted, but they look like they've been painted. Extraordinary markings feature along with hyenas and leopards and lions, and as who's going to, rule this particular patch of Africa. And it's just wonderful watching them because, they obviously, they are wild dogs, but they do, they behave so dog-like. It's wonderful when you see dogs being dogs. and that's something I'm quite passionate about. But, these wild dogs, I mean, I'm sure they're just, tiny. I was thinking when I was watching it, I wonder if you could adopt one. I was thinking, I'll have a wild dog, a painted wild dog in Hackney, which would be quite strange.
Very interesting. The African wild dog is actually a different species.
No.
So it's not, so they look so much like what we think of as wolves and then our domestic dogs. But it's a species called Lycaon pictus. So it's actually much closer related to jackals. So it is truly a wild. It's not a feral domestic animal. It's called the painted dog, as a generic term between dog and canid and all these kind of terms that we use. But it's a purely wild species of canid that lives in Africa. They are absolutely beautiful. There were some at the Chester Zoo when I was living in Liverpool, and it was always my favorite exhibit to go wander by and watch them live in their little packs and roaming around in the north of England, probably wondering how they got there from Africa.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Gosh, one other thing. A while ago, I did an interview with some Oxford scientists, actually, and it was this great excitement that they'd actually found a pretty intact skull because it was because of the thawing up in Siberia that they found it, and it was so perfectly preserved. It had fur, it had teeth, and they were pretty sure it was a dog. But then results actually proved indeed its DNA was wolf. But of course, this. Again, it's so sort of 50-50, isn't it? Because how can you be totally sure it wasn't an early dog? Very big. It was obviously still quite a prehistoric creature.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important point and something that as an archaeologist who's interested in the relationship between humans and animals, not necessarily just the classification of them as dogs or wolves or wild or domestic. I think that's really important that we remember that the earliest dogs would have had to have been wolves, right? The earliest wolves to come and live around people to start to form the relationship that led to what we have today genetically would have looked like wolves, physically would have looked like wolves, right? To get to domestication, we have to have kind of sustained generational breeding or like breeding as in birthing, right? Rather than breeding as in creating breeds. Having that kind of generational relationship with an animal that allows the differences in shape and size to appear. But in order to do that, you have to get pretty close to a wolf, and you probably lots of wolves actually. And so it's absolutely true that those earliest relationships that humans had with one of these kind of canids was with wolves. And so it's important to remember that when we start to think about, what's the earliest dog, based on some science, depending on which evidence you're using, they'll still probably look like wolves, or genetically suggest to be wolves. But it's the relationship between the human and the wolf that starts to create the dog. And that's something that we can't necessarily capture, even with the really kind of powerful science techniques that we have today.
So interesting. But then when you think about wolves, they're pack animals, they're very social creatures. They like balance and boundaries in their life. They're friendly. People think wolves. I mean, I can't bear the thought that even in Sweden, they're still shooting them. I can't, they're killing them in northern Sweden, or they were at least sort of only 6 years ago. And that's something I can't believe, because, they're very precious creatures and they're not horrible. They might, they're steeped in mythology and vampires and all the rest of it. And it's all wrong. It's all nothing, isn't it?
Well, I think that it's a really interesting point to think about wolves as social animals and as pack hunters. Because these are some of the things when we start to think about why would humans do this? Why somewhere between 10 and 20,000 years ago, would humans who are kind of living in their own packs and hunting communally on a landscape that looks a little bit different than what it looks like today, but wouldn't be totally unfamiliar, why would they think, oh, what we need is another species to come hang out with us? So we're trying to think about the motivations for that, and actually how similar hunter-gatherer humans and wolves in terms of their social kind of pack organization, in terms of their hunting strategies, which is kind of collective hunting to bring down one or two big prey of hunting the same species, really, right? So they're interested in hunting large deer and other types of kind of big mammals that are running around the landscape. And so there's a lot of similarities when we think about this time period between humans and wolves. That is potentially one of the reasons. We don't know, and interpreting the motivations of ancient humans is impossible to do. But it could really suggest, right, they might have seen something in each other and gone, we're doing the same things. We are not the apex predators that we think of as humans and wolves being today, right? During this time period, there are cave lions, there are cave hyenas, there are some really big things that are dominating the kind of food chain. And both wolves and humans are kind of in that middle tier below. And these kind of mid-level predators, they're not the top of the food chain, which is what we maybe think about them today. So I think the relationship is really interesting of maybe seeing something in each other, and that is potentially part of what's allowed that relationship to kind of grow into what it has today.
Yeah, and I always think of the Jungle Book, actually, because obviously Mowgli was raised by a pack of wolves, and in the first 1950s cartoon, which I'm sure you've seen, the wolves were hardly mentioned, because in that time, everyone still hated wolves. They were still being, shot, and Yellowstone Park, I don't think, was preserving them at that point in the 50s. Roll on to the latest sort of film one from a few years ago. The wolves are like central, like they are playing a major role and showing themselves as really social, caring animals, and which I actually thought was really interesting, because you're absolutely right. I mean, we think of ourselves when we think of the past with dogs, but of course we weren't like we are now. We were far from it. I mean, we do have to remember, as dogs are related to wolves, the truth is we're very close to chimpanzees. There's an interesting, massive conversation there, isn't there, Carly?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to when we start to think about that is that because wolves are not this food animal that we talked about, that there has to be some other motivation for forming that early relationship. And then that's where we can start to think about these interesting things about actually what is similar between humans and wolves, what could have attracted them to each other, how did something like this that seems very unusual and certainly was unique at the time period, right? There's no other earlier evidence of any relationship humans have with another animal prior to the wolf, besides just as utilitarian, like hunting them and using them in this way. So I think that it's really important to think about the reasons, even if we can't ever really know, right? We can't ever definitively say, oh, it's definitely because of this. It's really important to think about the kinds of similarities that could have led to that relationship, and how different human societies were at the time, and the landscape around us, and just allowed these things to happen in different ways than we would maybe imagine them today.
It's absolutely brilliant. Gosh, Carly, I'd love to chat for hours and hours, but thank you, for this episode. And I think, hopefully it's food for thought for lots of people, and, thinking about your dog and how it's evolved, from these pretty smart wolf dogs from way back, how they thought, yep, I think we could partner with these funny old humans. There might be something in it for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Carly. That's our show, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, go on, rate and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again, of course, to Carly Ameen for joining us today and talking about her very revealing research. Thanks, of course, to Mike Hansen, my producer, for all the music and production as ever. And if you're interested in learning more about Antinol, I urge you to go to their website and use my discount code at checkout, which is really easy. It's just Anna Webb. All the links, of course, are in the show notes. And if you haven't subscribed already, go on. It's so easy, and it just means you'll never miss another show. Bye for now.
Pod people.